The bell above the door of the lending library chimed a single clear note, a sound as clean and orderly as the shop itself. Margaret Ashworth did not look up. She knew the sound of Mrs. Gaballa's tread, the way her boot heels struck the floorboards with the brisk, impatient rhythm of a woman who believed her errands were the most important events in the village of Merchester. The scent of damp wool and winter air followed her in, a temporary disruption to the Liber-Law's familiar perfume of paper leather and lemon polish. Margaret remained bent over her ledger, the fine tip of her pen scratching a quiet tally of the day's returns. Ink stained the side of her index finger, a permanent mark of her profession. Her dress was gray, practical, its linen collar starched to a sharp, uncompromising line. Everything about her was neat, contained, and deliberately unremarkable. It was a kind of armor. A Miss Ashworth, Mrs. Gable, announced her voice, carrying the same brisk authority as her footsteps. She placed a novel on the counter with a thump. The Sorrows of a Governess. Margaret resisted the urge to smile. It was the third time Mrs. Gable had borrowed it this year. A dreary afternoon. Indeed, Mrs. Gable, Margaret replied, finally looking up. Her smile was small, polite, a carefully calibrated expression that offered welcome without inviting intimacy. It trust the book was to your satisfaction. It passes the time. The woman's gaze swept the tidy shelves, the neatly stacked periodicals, the pot of winter violets on the sill. It was the look of a general inspecting a barracks, searching for dust or disorder. Her eyes, small and sharp, came to rest on Margaret. You are looking a little peaked, my dear. Too much time indoors with these dusty old things. I find the company agreeable, Margaret said, her tone perfectly even. She took the returned book, opened it, and checked the pages for damage with a practiced hand. It was a habit born of necessity. Books were her livelihood, the small kingdom she had built for herself after the larger one had crumbled. The ruin had been swift and total. One whispered accusation, a lie spun to protect a guilty young man of good family, and her father's name had been destroyed. They had lost everything, the house, the standing, the future, that had once seemed as solid as the ground beneath their feet. After her father's death, a man broken by shame, Margaret had taken what little remained and opened this library. It was a respectable trade for a gentlewoman of fallen means. It was also a cage. Here, she was useful. She provided a service. No one had to invite her to dinner or worry about her prospects. She was Miss Ashworth of the lending library. Self-sufficient. The word for a horse that does not need to be fed. Mrs. Gable was still watching her. Well, it is good to see you keeping busy. Idleness is the devil's workshop, is it not? She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, especially with the Duke back at the hall. Margaret's hand stilled for a fraction of a second on the page. Carrie had not heard his Grace was in residence, arrived 2 days ago. My cousin's girl is a maid up at Blackmore, says the whole place has been turned upside down. Fires lit in rooms that have been cold for 10 years. The Duke, she says, is quiet. Quiet was the word everyone used for Duke Alexander Vane. Quiet and cold and distant. He had inherited the title and the vast, neglected northern estate of Blackmore as a young man, after a tragedy had claimed his entire family. He rarely visited, and when he did, he remained shuttered away in the West Wing, a ghost in his own house. Cumper Sass, I am sure. The staff are glad of the employment, Margaret offered. Closing the ledger, the bell chimed again. This time, the sound was different, absorbed by the heavy wool of a manus greatcoat. The air shifted, growing still and heavy. Mrs. Gable straightened up, her expression a mixture of awe and alarm. Margaret looked toward the door and felt a familiar, unwelcome tightening in her chest. It was him. Duke Alexander Vane stood just inside the door, his height and the breadth of his shoulders seeming to shrink the small room. Snowflakes melted on the dark sable of his collar. His face was stark, carved from pale marble, with a severe mouth and eyes the color of a winter sky. He was not handsome in the charming, easy way of other men of his rank. He was arresting, a figure of formidable stillness. He looked, Margaret thought, profoundly lonely. He had been coming to the library for nearly a year, ever since he had begun his infrequent visits to the estate. He never spoke more than a few words. He would browse the shelves, his gloved hands moving with a strange, careful reverence over the spines, select a book of history or philosophy, and place the subscription fee on the counter without a word. He looked at her, but his gaze was unreadable, distant. She was simply the functionary who stamped his card. Another part of the machinery of the world. Today, however, he was not alone. Behind him stood a footman in the vain livery, a man whose expression of pained neutrality suggested he would rather be anywhere else. The footman was holding a flat, square box wrapped in plain brown paper. The Duca's gaze met Margaret's. For a moment the air crackled. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. "A Miss Ashworth. A Your Grace," she murmured, her voice a little tight. She was intensely aware of Mrs. Gable beside her, practically vibrating with curiosity. The Duke did not move toward the shelves. He simply stood there, a dark, silent pillar, and gestured with one gloved finger toward the footman. The man stepped forward and placed the box on the counter. It landed with a soft, expensive thud. "A delivery for you, Miss Ashworth," the Duke said. His voice was low and gravelly, a sound that seemed to come from some deep, unused place. Margaret stared at the box. It was a respectable size, tied with simple twine, but she knew, with a sinking certainty, that its contents would be anything but simple. This was a disruption, a violation of the unspoken rules of their quiet, transactional acquaintance. For me, Your Grace?" she asked, her voice betraying a faint tremor she could not control. There must be some mistake." There is no mistake." His eyes held hers, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond that cold distance. Uncertainty, perhaps even a hint of desperation. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. "A good day." He turned and was gone, the bells sounding a final, definitive note in his wake. The footman, with a visible sigh of relief, followed him out. Margaret was left staring at the box, acutely conscious of Mrs. Gable's stare burning into the side of her face. The silence in the shop was thick with unspoken questions. Well," Mrs. Gable breathed, her eyes wide. Well, I never." Margaret felt a cold, dread pool in her stomach. She knew what this looked like. A wealthy, powerful man bestowing a gift upon a woman of no means or standing. It was the plot of a dozen cheap novels on her own shelves, and it never ended well for the woman. It painted her as a commodity, a dalliance, a creature to be bought and set aside. With deliberate, steady hands, she picked up the box. It was heavier than she expected. She did not need to open it to know it was something she could not possibly accept. Her pride, the only unmortgaged property she had left, would not allow it. She looked at Mrs. Gable, her expression calm, her resolve hardening into a shield. There has, as I said, been a mistake. Would you be so kind as to watch the shop for a moment? I must arrange for this to be returned." She did not wait for an answer. She carried the box into the small room behind the shop, her heart pounding a dull, angry rhythm against her ribs. She would not be a subject of gossip. She would not be a project for a lonely duke. She would not be bought. She found a fresh sheet of brown paper and a length of twine. She did not open the box. To open it would be to acknowledge it as a gift. It was merely a misplaced object, an error to be corrected. She wrapped it neatly, her fingers moving with precision, and penned a short, formal note. "Your Grace, this was delivered to my establishment in error. I have arranged for its immediate return. Respectfully, M. Ashworth." She sealed the note and tied it to the package. Then she summoned the baker's boy, pressed a coin into his hand, and gave him explicit instructions to deliver the parcel to the main entrance of Blackmore Hall, and to wait for no reply. As she watched the boy trudge off through the sleet, the package tucked under his arm, A strange sense of loss mingled with her relief. It was the first gift she had been offered since her father's death, and she had sent it back without a second thought. It was the only thing she could do. The next day another box arrived. This one was longer, narrower, and delivered by the same footman, whose expression had now curdled from neutral to openly resentful. He placed it on the counter, muttered a from his grace, and fled before Margaret could form a single word of protest. This time the shop was empty. It was early morning, the gray light barely strong enough to penetrate the front window. Margaret stood for a long time, just looking at the parcel. It was an act of aggression, she decided, a refusal to accept her refusal. He was a duke. He was not accustomed to being told no. He probably thought it a game. She felt a surge of anger, cold and sharp. Did he think her so easily swayed? Did he believe persistence would wear down her principles? Her principles. She ran a hand over her face. The dry irony of it all, a bitter taste in her mouth. Her principles had left her alone, in a small shop, in a small town, measuring out her life in borrowed books and pennies for subscriptions. But they were all she had. They were the foundation on which she stood. Again, she did not open the box. She rewrapped it, wrote an identical note, and paid the same Bikura's boy to make the same journey up the hill to Blackmore. She told herself it was a matter of dignity, but as the boy disappeared from view, she felt that same strange pang of regret. A foolish, illogical whisper in the back of her mind wondered what was inside. He noticed the return of the second package with a quiet clench of his jaw. Alexander Vane stood at the window of his study, a vast, cold room, where the furniture was still draped in Holland cloth, and watched the boy from the village trudge back down the long, winding drive of Blackmore. The boy was empty-handed. The package sat on the great mahogany desk behind him, a silent rebuke. It was identical to the first one, still wrapped in her neat brown paper, her note with its prim formal script tied to the top, delivered in error. It was not an error, it was, he was beginning to realize, a profound miscalculation. He had thought it simple. He was a man of immense wealth, and she was not. He had seen her in that little shop, an island of quiet order in a sea of village chatter. He had noticed the smudge of ink on her finger, the weary line of her shoulders at the end of the day, the way she treated the most tedious customer, with the same grave courtesy. She was like a finely made watch, all quiet, competence and hidden intricacy. He had found himself thinking of her at odd hours, the memory of her calm face, a balm in the echoing silence of the hall. He had wanted to give her something beautiful, to see her face light up with pleasure, to ease the weary set of her shoulders. The necklace in the first box, a string of pearls, elegant and understated, had seemed appropriate. When she had returned it, he had been baffled. Perhaps it was too personal, so he had sent the second gift, a bolt of French silk, the color of a twilight sky, impersonal, a simple luxury, and she had returned that too. He ran a hand through his hair. He was 35 years old, a duke, responsible for thousands of acres and hundreds of tenants, and he did not know how to give a woman a gift. His parents had died when he was a boy, and the uncle who had raised him had been a man who understood duty and finance and power, but not affection. Affection was a currency in which Alexander was utterly bankrupt. He had learned to command, to manage, to rule. He had never learned to connect. He walked over to the desk and touched the corner of the returned package. Her handwriting was as neat and controlled as she was. He had thought to please her with objects of value, but he had only insulted her. He had treated her like any other woman who might be flattered by a duke's attention, and in doing so, he had revealed that he did not see her at all. Only her circumstances. A slow, unfamiliar heat rose in his chest. It was not anger, it was a grudging, painful respect. She was not playing a game. She was telling him something, in the only way she could. He looked around the cold, silent study. For the first time since he had inherited this place, he saw it not as a monument to his family's legacy, but as a tomb, a vast, empty mausoleum. He had locked himself inside. She had returned his gifts. She had refused to let him breach the walls of her small, orderly world with his clumsy, thoughtless wealth. Perhaps, he thought with a sudden startling clarity, the point was not to breach her walls, but to invite her to leave them, and for that, he would need a different kind of gift entirely. He sat down at the desk, pulled the sheet of paper toward him, and began to write. Not a note this time, a list. The gifts continued to arrive, one every other day, a relentless, silent siege. A cashmere shawl, a set of leather-bound poetry books, a silver tea service. Each one arrived. Each one was promptly wrapped, noted, and returned. The gossip in Merchester grew from a whisper to a roar. Margaret felt the eyes of the town on her wherever she went. The women who frequented her library now looked at her with a mixture of envy and suspicion. They asked leading questions, their curiosity poorly veiled. That is the fourth carriage from the hall this week, Miss Ashworth, a woman remarked, her voice sharp. His Grace must have a great deal of business in the village. His Grace's business is not my concern, Margaret replied, her voice cool, her hands steady as she stamped a book. But her heart hammered against her ribs. She was becoming a spectacle, a story. The shopkeeper who turned the Duque head. It was a narrative that stripped her of all agency, all dignity. The architect of this campaign of whispers was Lady Beatrice Croft. She was a distant cousin of the Duca's, a handsome, sharp-featured woman with a title but no fortune, who had made it her life's ambition to become the next Duchess of Blackmore. She had begun to frequent the library, a place she had previously disdained, her visits thinly disguised reconnaissance missions. She would trail a gloved finger along a shelf, her expression one of faint disgust. So many books. She said one afternoon, her voice loud enough for the other patrons to hear. I cannot imagine having the time. But then, some of us have social obligations. She paused, her eyes landing on Margaret with calculated pity. And some of us do not. Margaret refused to be drawn. A subscription is 1 shilling a month, Lady Beatrice. If you are not interested in borrowing, perhaps the milliner's shop would be more to your taste. A flicker of fury crossed Lady Beatrice's face before being replaced by a sweet, malicious smile. Oh, but I am fascinated, Miss Ashworth. Truly, everyone is. To command such a persistent attention from a man like the Duke, one must have some very particular hidden talents. The insinuation was as sharp and dirty as a fishhook. It caught in the air, and Margaret felt the other women in the shop go still, listening. The crime was that she had been chosen first. That was the root of it. Alexander Vane could have had any woman in the county. He had shown interest in none of them. And then, he had fixed his strange, silent attention on her. A woman with no family, no fortune, no name to speak of. It was an affront to the natural order of things, and Lady Beatrice was positioning herself as its chief prosecutor. Margaret met her gaze, her own expression unreadable. My only talent, my lady, is for bookkeeping. Now, if you will excuse me, I have accounts to attend to. She retreated to the back room, her hands trembling slightly. She leaned against the cool wood of the door and closed her eyes. This was the consequence of his actions. He sat in his grand isolated hall, sending his packages, oblivious to the social currents he was churning in the village below. He was wounding her, not with cruelty, but with careless, unthinking kindness. A few days later, the nature of the gifts began to change. The footman, now a permanent fixture of her mornings, arrived not with a box, but with a large potted plant. It was a camellia, its dark green leaves glossy, a single, perfect white bud waiting to open. It was alive. It was not something that could be easily wrapped in brown paper. Margaret stared at it. This was a new level of difficulty. She could not simply return it. It would die on the journey. It felt personal. A plant needed care. It was not a jewel to be locked away or a piece of silk to be folded. For the first time she hesitated. She touched one of the glossy leaves. The thought of sending it back to the cold, echoing halls of Blackmore felt needlessly cruel, but her resolve held. It was still a gift. It was still a public declaration. She found the largest crate she could, packed it carefully with straw, and wrote a new note. Your Grace, I do not have the appropriate conditions to ensure this plant would thrive. I am returning it so that it might receive the expert care it requires. Respectfully, M. Ashworth. She paid the Big boy double for his trouble. He was learning, Alexander thought. As he supervised the gardener, replanting the camellia in the lukewarm glass of the conservatory, he had seen the crate, the straw, the carefully worded note. She had not simply rejected it. She had protected it. She had been concerned for its welfare. He was beginning to understand. The value of the gift was an insult. The public nature of it was a threat. She was not a fortress to be taken by storm, but a walled garden, and the only way in was to be invited. He walked through the dusty, silent rooms of his home. His uncle had taught him that the vain name was a shield. It had protected him from the pain of his parents' loss, from the grasping hands of ambitious mothers, from the emptiness of his own life. But a shield, held for too long, becomes a prison. He stopped before a portrait of his mother. She had loved books. The library at Blackmore, once the heart of the house, had been her domain. After her death, his uncle had locked it. A grief is a private matter. Alexander, he had said. Oh, we do not dwell, and so he had not. He had not entered the library in 20 years. The key, a heavy, ornate piece of iron, sat in a drawer in his desk. He looked at his mother's face in the portrait, at the gentle intelligence in her eyes. He thought of Margaret Ashworth, with her ink-stained fingers and her quiet, unyielding dignity. He knew what the next gift had to be. The next delivery was a book, not a set of expensive new bindings, but a single, worn volume. A first edition of a collection of botanical essays she had once mentioned in passing. A book she had said was almost impossible to find. It was not wrapped in paper. The footman simply handed it to her, his expression one of utter bewilderment. Margaret took it, her fingers tracing the faded gold leaf on the cover. Her heart did a slow, painful turn in her chest. He had been listening. All those times he had stood silently by the counter. He had been listening. This was not a gift of wealth. It was a gift of attention. She could not send it back. To return, this would be to return a memory, a shared moment. It would be a rejection, not of his money, but of him. And yet she had to. The eyes of the village were still on her. Lady Beatricia's campaign was escalating. To accept now would be to admit defeat, to concede that she could be won over if only he found the right price. Her hands shook as she wrapped the book. The note she wrote this time was shorter. The formal respect was gone, replaced by a raw plea. Your Grace, please, stop. When Alexander read those two words, a profound silence seemed to fall over the world. It was not the angry silence of rejection, but the quiet, aching silence of pain. He had pushed her too far. He had thought he was being clever, personal. He had only tightened the screws. He looked at the note, at her elegant script, now slightly unsteady. Please, stop. He had been so focused on his own loneliness, on his clumsy attempts to breach it, that he had failed to see he was not building a bridge, but cornering a frightened animal. He was causing her distress. The thought was like a physical blow. He stood up and walked to the window, looking down the valley toward the distant slate roofs of Merchester. He had isolated her. He had made her a target, and Lady Beatrice, he knew his cousin well enough to guess, would be circling. He had to fix it, not with another gift, with the truth. But the truth was a language he had long forgotten how to speak. He would have to learn again, and he would have to do it in public. The annual Merchester Charity Bazaar was in a week. It was the social event of the season. Everyone would be there. Lady Beatrice would be there. And Margaret Ashworth, he knew, would be there presiding over a small stall of donated books to raise funds for the church roof. It would be the perfect stage for a final humiliation, or a final act of grace. He went to his desk, took out the heavy iron key to the library, and closed his hand around it. The metal was cold, unyielding. It was the last gift, and he would not send it. He would deliver it himself. The day of the bazaar was bright and cruelly cold. The village green was a flurry of activity, tents and stalls decorated with winter holly and ribbons. The gentry of the county mixed with the townspeople, a fragile truce of charity and commerce brokered for a single afternoon. Margaret stood behind her stall, a trestle table laden with donated books, her hands numb inside her thin woolen gloves. She had dreaded this day. It was an unavoidable public appearance, and she could feel the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on her. They were not looking at her books. They were looking at her. The whispers followed her like a cloud of gnats. A there she is. A looks rather plain, doesn't it, Shia? They say he sent her joie. A she sent them back. The nerve of it. A tree. She kept her chin high, her expression serene, arranging and rearranging the books. She was a shopkeeper. This was her trade. Lady Beatrice arrived shortly after noon, sweeping through the crowd like a ship in full sail. She was dressed in a magnificent gown of deep crimson velvet, a stark contrast to Margaria's practical gray. She made a great show of visiting several stalls, her laughter loud and brittle, before finally making her way to the book table. She did not approach directly, but stood a few feet away, speaking to a group of her friends, her voice pitched to Carrie. It is a sad thing, is it not?" she began, her tone dripping with false sympathy. When a person's ambition outstrips their station, it can lead to such a misunderstandings." Margaret continued to straighten a stack of novels, her back to the woman. She would not give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Some people," a Lady Beatrice went on, raising her voice slightly, will do anything for attention, falsify their own histories, pretend to be something they are not. It is an old story, eh? This was it, the attack she had been dreading. Margretta's past, the lie that had destroyed her family, was a closely guarded secret in Merchester. Only a few of the oldest families knew the truth of the Ashworth's fall from grace. Lady Beatrice must have spent a great deal of time and effort digging it up. Indeed, one of Beatrice's companions, a simpering young woman named Miss Pringle, chimed in. "I heard a story once about a companion in York, accused of stealing a bracelet from her mistress. A terrible scandal. The family was ruined. The girl, of course, vanished." A wave of nausea washed over Margaret. It was her story, twisted and made vile. She had not stolen the bracelet. Her mistress's son had taken it to pay a gambling debt, and Margaret, out of a misguided sense of loyalty to the woman who had been kind to her, had remained silent when he had let the blame fall on her. It was a silence that had cost her everything. She turned slowly, her face pale but her eyes clear. She would not let them break her. A sad story, indeed," she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the sudden lull. "Especially for the girl, who was innocent." Lady Beatrice laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Oh, they all say they are innocent, don't it they? It is what one would expect. But when a woman of no standing suddenly becomes the object of a great manassa charitia, one must begin to question her character. One must wonder what she did to deserve it, or what she might be hiding." The crowd was silent now, watching the drama unfold. This was better than any novel, the plain little shopkeeper being brought low by the grand lady. Margaret stood alone, the target of it all, her reputation being dismantled, thread by thread in the cold winter air. She felt a profound and weary despair settle over her. She had fought so hard to build this small, respectable life, and it was being torn apart for sport. And then, a new voice cut through the tension. Low, calm, and utterly authoritative, a cruelty seems already abundant this afternoon. "Beatrice, I see no reason to add mine." A path parted in the crowd. Duke Alexander Vane stood there, his presence silencing every whisper. He was not looking at his cousin. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were fixed on Margaret, and in them she saw not pity, but a fierce, protective anger. He walked toward the stall, his boots crunching on the frosty grass. He stopped directly in front of her, creating a barrier between her and the rest of the world. He ignored the gasps of the crowd, the furious, thwarted expression on Lady Beatrice's face. He was looking only at Margaret. "I notice effort, Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice soft enough that only she could hear. "I have always noticed it." He gestured to the books. "Ah, you have built something admirable here. Something of value. Eh. Then he raised his voice, speaking to the silent, watching crowd. Miss Ashworth's library is a credit to this village. Her knowledge of literature is surpassed only by her integrity. It was a public declaration, a shield thrown over her. He was using his immense status not to command, but to defend. Lady Beatrice, recovering herself, gave a tight, furious smile. Your grace is too kind." Defending the reputation of a simple shopkeeper. "It is most democratic of you." Alexander turned his head slowly to look at her. The coldness in his eyes could have frozen fire. The Ashworth name was once as respected as yours, cousin, and far more deservedly so. I have recently had cause to review the details of their misfortune. An injustice I intend to see rectified. The man who cast the blame for his own theft on an innocent girl has lived with his lie long enough. I believe a conversation with his father is long overdue." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Lady Beatrice went pale. He knew he had not just defended Margaret, he had investigated. He had found the truth. He turned back to Margaret, his expression softening. He reached into the pocket of his greatcoat and drew something out. It was not a jewel, it was not a trinket, it was a large, heavy, ornate iron key. He held it out to her. His hand was bare, his glove removed. It was the first time she had seen his hand, without its leather covering. It was a strong hand, with long fingers. This is the last gift, Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice low and earnest. "And it is not a gift, it is an offer of employment. And a request for help. Top A." She stared at the key, her heart pounding. "The library at Blackmore has been closed for 20 years, he continued, his gaze unwavering. It is my mother's legacy, and I have let it fall to ruin. The books are decaying. The room is filled with ghosts. I do not know how to fix it, but you do. Your talent is for order, for care, for bringing things back to life. I am asking you to be the librarian of Blackmore Hall." He paused, and his next words were a quiet confession, spoken in the midst of 100 silent witnesses. "I need your help." He was not offering her charity. He was not trying to buy her. He was offering her a purpose that matched her skills. He was offering her respect. He was admitting his own failure, his own need. He had finally understood. Slowly, her fingers trembling, Margaret reached out and took the key from his hand. Its weight was solid, real. Her fingers brushed against his, and a jolt of warmth, shocking and unexpected, shot up her arm. She closed her hand around the key. I accept your grace," she said, her voice clear and strong. And in the profound, astonished silence of the village green, she finally, truly, opened the last gift. The library at Blackmore was a place of breathtaking sadness. It was a vast 2-story room, lined with shelves that rose into the shadowed gloom. But dust lay thick as felt on every surface. The air was cold and musty, the scent of decay hanging heavy. Patches of damp stained the wallpaper, and in one corner, a stack of books had succumbed to mold, their pages swollen and ruined. A great globe stood shrouded in a dusty sheet, a pale ghost in the center of the room. Margaret stood in the doorway, the heavy key still clutched in her hand, and felt a pang of sorrow for the room and for the woman who had loved it. This was not just neglect. It was a deliberate turning away, a monument to unresolved grief. Alexander stood beside her. his stillness a stark contrast to the chaos of the room. He had not spoken on the short carriage ride up to the hall, a silence she had been grateful for. The events of the bazaar had left her feeling scoured, raw, exposed, and yet strangely, fiercely alive. My uncle locked it the day after the funeral," he said. Into the quiet, his voice flat. "Ah, he said we were to look forward, not back. I was 12 years old. I never questioned him. It is easier to lock a door than to face what is behind it," Margaret said softly. She took a step into the room, her boots leaving prints in the thick dust. "I was a coward," he said, the words stark and unadorned. For 20 years, I have been a coward." You were a grieving boy who became a man with too many duties," she corrected gently, turning to face him. "A grief does not follow a timetable." "Your Grace Alexander," he said. The name, dropping into the silence like a stone into a deep well. My name is Alexander." She met his eyes. The winter sky was still there, but the chill had receded. She saw the boy he had been, lost and alone in this vast, cold house. Alexander," she repeated, testing the sound of it. There is much to be done here." That was how it began, not with declarations of love, but with lists. Lists of books to be salvaged, lists of repairs for the carpenter, lists of supplies they would need from the village. They worked, side by side, day after day, in the quiet, dusty library. Margaret hired 2 of the village girls to help with the cleaning, and under her direction, the room slowly began to breathe again. The sheets came off the furniture, the windows were washed, letting in the pale winter light. The cloying scent of dust and decay was gradually replaced by the clean smells of beeswax and turpentine. Alexander was a constant, silent presence. He did not direct or command. He hauled stacks of books, his fine coat discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He climbed ladders to inspect the high shelves, his movements sure and steady. He learned to mix the linseed oil and pigment for treating the cracked leather bindings, his large hands surprisingly deft. They spoke of books, of history, of the best way to repair a torn page. They fell into a comfortable rhythm, a partnership built on shared purpose. In the quiet industry of their work, the walls between them began to crumble. She saw the man beneath the title of thoughtful, capable, and profoundly shy. He saw the woman beneath the armor, intelligent, kind, with a dry wit that surfaced in unexpected moments. One afternoon, as they worked to catalog a section of botanical texts, she found a pressed flower tucked between the pages of a book. It was a single, faded violet. My mother's, Alexander said, his voice quiet. He had come to stand beside her. She used to press them. She said it was a way of keeping a piece of the spring through the winter. Margaret looked from the faded flower to his face. You should not erase her from this house. Alexander. This rune should be a testament to her, not a tomb. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze on the small, fragile flower in her palm. No one has spoken her name in this house for 20 years, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he did not try to hide, which had been stored in the attics to be cleaned and rehung over the library mantelpiece. When it was in place, the firelight, catching the warmth and intelligence in the painted eyes, it felt as though the heart of the house had started beating again. As the library came back to life, so did the rest of Blackmore. The fires were not just for show now. They burned to warm rooms that were being used. The scent of baking bread drifted from the kitchens. The sound of the maid's laughter echoed in the halls. Margaret had brought more than order to the library. She had brought life back to the entire house. She still lived in her small rooms above the lending library, which she had left in the capable hands of a young widow from the village. Every morning she walked up the hill to the hall, and every evening she walked back down. It was a boundary she maintained, a small piece of her independence. But the walks home began to feel longer, the rooms above the shop emptier, but her small, neat kingdom felt less like a fortress now, and more like a cage. She had found a place where she was not just useful, but needed. Where her mind was valued, her presence sought. She had found a place where she felt a home. One evening, a sudden snowstorm blew in, blanketing the countryside in a thick layer of white. It was too dangerous to walk back to the village. The housekeeper, a kindly woman who had watched the transformation of her master with quiet approval, insisted Margaret stay the night. She was given a room in the east wing, a lovely chamber with a four-poster bed and a fire crackling in the hearth. After she had eaten, she found herself drawn back to the library. Alexander was there, standing before the fire, one hand resting on the mantelpiece beneath his mother's portrait. He was staring into the flames, his expression thoughtful. I spoke with Lord Ashwell today," he said, without turning. "The father of the young man who wronged you." Margaret's heart stilled. "You did not have to do that." Did," he said, finally turning to face her. The truth has been buried long enough. Your family's name will be cleared. What was taken will be restored." She stood across the hearth from him, the firelight dancing between them. Thank you," she whispered. It was all she could manage. It is not enough," he said, his voice low and intense. Margaret, He stopped, running a hand through his hair in a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of his inner turmoil. I am not good with words. I have spent my life building walls, not bridges. When I met you, I saw something true, and I tried to possess it. I sent you gifts because it was the only language I knew. The language of a duke, of wealth, of power. It was a coward's method. It was a lonely monist method, she said softly. His eyes met hers, and the vulnerability in them took her breath away. I did not expect to care whether you stayed. I did not expect this house to feel empty when you leave it each evening. I did not expect my Dolores library to feel like my own home. For the first time in my life, he took a step toward her, closing the small distance between them. Those gifts, they were not for you. Not really, they were for me. An attempt to buy my way out of the silence. But you refused. You demanded something real. You demanded that I see you. And I do, Margaret. I see you. He reached out, not to touch her, but holding his hand open in the space between them. An invitation. I do not want to give you things anymore. I want to give you my time, my respect, my name, if you will have it. Ada, her breath caught in her throat. Alexander, do not say it. If it is only gratitude, he said, quickly, his voice raw. Ada, not. I could not bear that. It is not gratitude, she said, her voice shaking slightly. She took a step forward and placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. I stayed because I love this library. I stayed because I was bringing it back to life. Quote. She looked up at him, her heart in her eyes. I stayed because I was falling in love with you. A slow, wondering smile transformed his face, chasing away the last of the shadows. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture of such tender reverence that it made her cry. Then stay, he whispered. Stay, and be the Duchess of Blackmore. Stay, and be my wife. Stay and fill this empty house with life. She did not answer with words. She simply tightened her grip on his hand. She stayed. Months later, on a bright spring morning, Margaret stood at the window of the Blackmore Library. The room was transformed. The shelves were orderly, the books clean and repaired. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the rich colors of the Turkish rug on the floor and the vibrant greens of the ferns she had placed near the windows. A fire burned brightly in the hearth, and above it, the Duchess Eleanor Vane smiled down from her portrait, no longer a ghost of the past, but a benevolent, presiding spirit. The sound of laughter drifted up from the gardens below. It was the sound of children of the orphans from the village, whom Margaret had invited to the hall for a day of games and stories. It was a sound that had not been heard at Blackmore for a generation. The library door opened, and Alexander came in. He came to her side, his arms sliding around her waist, drawing her back against him. He no longer looked like a man carved from ice. The warmth she had brought to his house, she had brought to him as well. "A Lady Beatrice sent her regrets for our wedding," he said, his chin resting on her hair. "She has decided to take a very long trip to the continent." How wise of her," Margaret murmured, leaning into his embrace. The scandal had died as quickly as it had been born. With the truth revealed and the Duke's favor so clearly bestowed, society had moved on to newer, more interesting gossip. "I have a gift for you," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. She stiffened slightly, a ghost of old reflex. He chuckled. "It is the last one, I promise." He pressed a small flat object into her hand. It was not a box, it was a book. Her own lending library ledger. She opened it. On the first blank page, in his strong, clear hand he had written, "For Margaret, who taught me the value of things that cannot be bought. For my wife, the woman who stayed." Tears welled in her eyes as she traced the words. All those returned gifts, all those battles of will, had led to this. Not a victory, but a union. A partnership of two lonely people who had found in each other the one thing they had both been missing, a home. She turned in his arms and kissed him, a slow, deep kiss filled with all the words they had never needed to say. Outside, the children's laughter rose on the spring air, a promise of the future. The house was no longer cold. The library was no longer silent, and Margaret, the overlooked woman, the quiet shopkeeper, was finally, irrevocably home. Do you have a favorite moment when you realized a character's true intentions? We love hearing your thoughts, especially where you're watching from. Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you enjoyed it, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more tales of love, loss, and redemption. We cherish our community and love reading about how our stories resonate with you. Let us know where you are in the world and what this story made you feel. We look forward to sharing another story with you tomorrow.